What if your brain has been lying to you your entire life, and you never noticed? Every decision you make, every opinion you hold, and every judgment you trust could be influenced by hidden mental shortcuts called cognitive biases. Some make you ignore the truth, others distort your memories, and one can make you feel right even when you're completely wrong. The most surprising part? Every single person has these biases, including you. So let's count down the most powerful cognitive biases and discover how they secretly shape the way you think. Number 10. Confirmation bias. Imagine your brain acting like a search engine that only shows results supporting what you already believe. That's confirmation bias. Instead of evaluating all available evidence equally, the brain naturally pays more attention to information that confirms existing opinions while ignoring or dismissing evidence that challenges them. Researchers have found that this bias helps the brain process information more efficiently, but it can also lead to poor judgment. For example, someone convinced a certain diet works may notice every success story while overlooking studies that show mixed results. The same pattern appears in politics, investing, relationships, and everyday conversations. Once a belief becomes emotionally important, the brain begins protecting it rather than testing it. Over time, confirmation bias can make people increasingly confident even when they are objectively wrong. Instead of learning from new information, they unintentionally build a mental world where every piece of evidence seems to support what they already think, making personal growth and critical thinking much more difficult. This explains why intelligent people with access to the same facts can reach completely opposite conclusions and remain convinced that their own perspective is unquestionably correct. Number 9. Anchoring bias. The first number, opinion, or piece of information you encounter often has far more influence than you realize. This is called anchoring bias. Researchers have found that the brain relies heavily on initial information when making later judgments, even when that first piece of information is completely unrelated. Imagine seeing a jacket originally priced at $200, but now discounted to $100. The original price becomes an anchor, making the sale appear far more attractive. The same effect influences salary negotiations, shopping decisions, courtroom judgments, and even medical estimates. Once the brain establishes an anchor, it adjusts around that starting point instead of evaluating the situation from scratch. Even experienced professionals can be affected by this shortcut. Anchoring demonstrates how quickly the brain forms reference points and how surprisingly difficult it becomes to ignore them, even after learning that the original information may have been misleading or entirely arbitrary. Marketers, negotiators, and advertisers frequently take advantage of this mental shortcut because they know first impressions often influence every judgment that follows. Number 8. Availability bias. Why do airplane crashes often seem more frightening than car accidents, despite being far less common? The answer often involves availability bias. Researchers have found that the brain estimates how likely something is based on how easily examples come to mind. Dramatic events receive extensive media coverage and therefore become easier to remember. As a result, they feel more common than they actually are. Everyday events that rarely make headlines may be statistically far more dangerous but receive much less attention. This mental shortcut helps the brain make quick decisions without analyzing massive amounts of data. However, it can also distort risk perception. People may overestimate rare dangers while underestimating common ones. Availability bias influences financial decisions, health concerns, travel choices, and countless everyday judgments. The easier it is for the brain to remember something, the more important or frequent it often appears, regardless of what the actual evidence shows. This is why emotionally powerful stories often change people's opinions more effectively than large collections of accurate statistics and scientific evidence. Number 7. Hindsight bias. After something happens, it often feels as though the outcome was obvious all along. This is hindsight bias. Researchers describe it as the brain's tendency to rewrite memories after learning the result of an event. Once you know the ending, your brain begins believing you predicted it from the beginning. A surprising election result suddenly feels inevitable. A successful business decision seems obvious in retrospect. Even personal mistakes often appear completely predictable after they occur. The problem is that hindsight bias creates an illusion of certainty. People become overconfident in their ability to predict future events because they mistakenly remember past outcomes as being easier to foresee than they actually were. This can reduce learning because the brain convinces itself there was never much uncertainty in the first place. Over time, Hindsight bias shapes confidence, decision-making, and how people interpret both successes and failures throughout life. It also encourages unfair judgments of others by making difficult decisions appear much simpler after knowing how events eventually unfolded. Number 6. Halo effect. First impressions are incredibly powerful, largely because of something known as the halo effect. Researchers have found that when people notice one positive characteristic, they often assume many other positive qualities exist as well. Someone who appears attractive may automatically be viewed as more intelligent, trustworthy, or competent, even without evidence. Likewise, a successful entrepreneur may be assumed to excel in completely unrelated areas simply because of one achievement. The brain prefers simple, consistent stories rather than evaluating every trait independently. This shortcut saves mental effort but often produces inaccurate judgments. The halo effect influences hiring decisions, elections, product marketing, education, and social relationships. It explains why charismatic individuals sometimes receive more trust than they deserve, and why first impressions can remain surprisingly difficult to change. Once the brain creates a positive overall image, it often interprets future information through that favorable lens, causing flaws and weaknesses to receive much less attention than they objectively deserve. Number 5. Negativity bias. Have you ever received 10 compliments but spent the entire day thinking about one criticism? That's negativity bias at work. Researchers have found that the human brain gives greater attention and emotional weight to negative experiences than positive ones. From an evolutionary perspective, paying attention to danger increased survival, so the brain became highly sensitive to potential threats. While this helped our ancestors avoid predators, it also means modern humans often remember failures, insults, disappointments, and embarrassing moments more vividly than achievements or praise. Negative news attracts more attention, criticism feels stronger than compliments, and bad experiences often linger much longer in memory. Over time, negativity bias can shape mood, confidence, relationships, and decision-making. Without realizing it, people may believe life is worse than it actually is, simply because the brain naturally gives more importance to unpleasant events than positive ones. This bias also explains why recovering from emotional setbacks usually takes much longer than enjoying moments of success, happiness, or appreciation, even when positive experiences happen more frequently throughout daily life. Number 4. Survivorship bias. Success stories are inspiring, but they don't always tell the whole story. Survivorship bias occurs when people focus only on successful outcomes, while ignoring all the unsuccessful cases that remain unseen. Researchers frequently warn about this bias because it can create misleading conclusions. For example, reading about wealthy entrepreneurs may lead someone to believe success is far more common than it actually is, because countless failed businesses receive far less attention. The same pattern appears in investing, education, fitness, and career advice. The brain naturally notices visible winners while overlooking invisible failures. As a result, people may copy strategies that appear successful without recognizing how many others tried the same approach unsuccessfully. Survivorship bias can encourage unrealistic expectations and overconfidence. Understanding it reminds us that the stories we hear are often only a small part of a much larger picture. Looking only at successful examples can create dangerous assumptions because the missing failures often contain the most valuable lessons about risk, preparation, and probability. Number 3. Dunning-Kruger effect. One of the most fascinating cognitive biases is the Dunning-Kruger effect. Researchers discovered that people with limited knowledge in a particular area often overestimate their own ability because they lack the expertise needed to recognize their mistakes. Ironically, greater knowledge frequently leads people to become less certain because they begin appreciating the complexity of the subject. The brain mistakes confidence for competence when experience is limited. This bias appears in workplaces, education, sports, investing, and everyday conversations. Someone with very little understanding may speak with absolute certainty, while true experts often acknowledge uncertainty and nuance. The Dunning-Kruger effect doesn't mean inexperienced people can never be correct. Instead, it demonstrates how difficult accurate self-evaluation can be. The less someone knows, the harder it often becomes for them to recognize the limits of their own understanding. At the same time, genuinely skilled individuals may underestimate themselves because they assume others possess the same level of knowledge and experience that they do. Number 2. Loss aversion. Imagine finding $100 and then losing the same amount the following day. Researchers have found that losing money usually feels far more painful than gaining the exact same amount feels rewarding. This tendency is known as loss aversion. The brain treats losses as psychologically more significant than equivalent gains. As a result, people often avoid risks even when potential rewards outweigh potential losses. Investors may hold failing investments too long because selling would make the loss feel real. Consumers hesitate to give up possessions simply because they already own them. Loss aversion influences negotiations, business decisions, relationships, and financial planning. The fear of losing something often becomes stronger than the excitement of gaining something new. This powerful emotional imbalance shapes countless decisions every single day, frequently without people realizing it. Businesses, advertisers, and marketers frequently use this bias by emphasizing what customers might lose rather than what they could potentially gain through a decision. Number 1. Self-serving bias. At the top of the list is self-serving bias, one of the brain's most powerful tools for protecting self-esteem. Researchers have found that people naturally tend to credit themselves for successes while blaming outside circumstances for failures. A promotion is viewed as proof of intelligence and hard work, while a setback is blamed on bad luck, unfair treatment, or difficult conditions. This bias helps preserve confidence and emotional stability, but it can also interfere with honest self-improvement. When the brain consistently protects its own image, learning from mistakes becomes more difficult. Relationships may suffer because people become less willing to accept responsibility for their actions. Over time, self-serving bias shapes identity, confidence, and personal decision-making in subtle yet powerful ways. It reminds us that the human brain isn't always searching for objective truth. Sometimes it's simply trying to protect the story we tell ourselves about who we are. Recognizing this bias allows people to become more self-aware, accept constructive criticism more openly, and make wiser decisions based on reality rather than protecting their ego. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe to see more.